The sound of hand-blown crystal shattering against white marble echoed through the dining room like a round of small arms fire. Zariah Cole, her voluminous natural curls fanning out like a dark halo mid-fall, crumpled to the floor of Seoul's most expensive Michelin-starred restaurant. Sparkling shards of $1,000 glassware surrounded her like jagged diamonds. Above her stood Vaughn, her ex-fiancé, his polished Oxford shoe still extended from the accidental trip, a handsome but cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Careful, Zariah," Ethan sneered, smoothing the lapels of his $10,000 tailored suit while his socialite friends watched with bored amusement. "You always did have a habit of breaking things you couldn't afford." But as Ethan pressed the sole of his shoe onto Zariah's hand, pinning her to the floor while the elite crowd raised their phones to record her shame, he was blissfully unaware of the shadow looming over him. He didn't notice the simple black silk choker around Zariah's neck, nor the microscopic transmitter hidden within its weave that had just sent a silent, high-priority distress signal to the penthouse suite. What Ethan didn't know, what no one in that room full of old money realized, was that the most feared man in the Korean underworld, Han Jae-hyun, was currently watching the live security feed from a private elevator just seconds away. The restaurant was a cathedral of excess, gold leaf ceilings, velvet drapes, and a wine list that cost more than a year's rent in most cities. And there, amidst the spilled Pinot Noir and shattered porcelain, Zariah lay gasping, her smooth, deep brown skin stark against the clinical white of her service shirt. The room went cold. The Black Dragon was coming, and Vaughn had just signed his own digital death warrant. "Hello, family. Nice to have you on here. Before we proceed, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comment section and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here." Now let's continue with the story. Ethan didn't move his foot. Instead, he applied a slow, agonizing pressure to the back of Zariah's hand, grinding her knuckles into the cold marble. He leaned down, his face a mask of handsome malice, perfectly lit by the restaurant's amber chandeliers. Around the table, his associates, men in slate-gray suits and women dripping in Bulgari, didn't look away. They leaned in, hungry for the spectacle. "You see this?" Ethan addressed his guests, his voice projecting with the practiced clarity of a man used to being heard. He gestured with a free hand toward Zariah, who remained frozen, her breath coming in shallow, controlled hitches. "This is the natural order of things. Some people are built to lead and others are built to carry the trays for those who do." A light titter of laughter rippled through the table. His new fiancé, Jae-hyun, sipped her vintage krug, her eyes tracking the curve of Zariah's athletic frame with a mixture of pity and disgust. "When I was with her," Ethan continued, his tone shifting into a mock confessional, "I tried to dress her up. I tried to give her a life that didn't involve a name tag. But you can't fight nature. You can take the girl out of the kitchen, but you can't take the servant out of the girl. She craves the grind. She missed the sweat, the orders, the feeling of being invisible." Zariah's eyes remained fixed on a jagged shard of crystal just inches from her face. She felt the heat of his shoe through her skin, but she didn't cry out. She was counting, not the seconds of her humiliation, but the heartbeats of the man she knew was watching through the lens of the overhead dome camera. "A woman like Zariah isn't built for the boardroom or the gala," Ethan sneered, increasing the pressure until a sharp wince escaped her lips. "She's built for the back of the house. She's excellent at following instructions, aren't you, Zariah? That's why she's a waitress. You don't marry the help, you use them until you're bored, and then you send them back to the floor to serve someone else. It's the only place they truly feel at home." He let out a sharp, barking laugh and finally retracted his foot, but not before kicking a stray piece of glass toward her face. "Now, be a good girl and clean up this mess. My guests are thirsty, and you're falling behind on your table rotation." The crowd around them, emboldened by his cruelty, began to whisper and point. The manager, a man who had shared coffee with Zariah just that morning, stood 10 feet away, his arms folded, refusing to meet her gaze. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the collective silence of the elite. Ethan turned back to his steak, dismissed her as if she were a ghost, and raised his glass in a toast to his own brilliance. He was a king in his own mind, reigning over a kingdom of velvet and glass, completely unaware that the real master of the house had just stepped into the private elevator. The sound of the chime was muffled by the chatter, but to Zariah, it sounded like the striking of a clock at midnight. The time for serving was over. The heavy, gilded doors of the restaurant's private elevator didn't just open. They hissed with a finality that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. The chime was a singular, crystalline note that cut through Ethan's laughter like a razor through silk. Silence rippled outward from the VIP corridor, a sudden, unnatural stillness that caused even the most intoxicated socialites to freeze with their glasses halfway to their lips. Then came the footsteps. They were slow, rhythmic, and heavy, with the kind of weight that suggested the very floor belonged to the man walking on it. Han Jae-hyun stepped into the soft amber glow of the dining room. He didn't wear a tie, his crisp black collar open to reveal the ink that crawled like a living shadow up the side of his neck, the intricate, dark scales of a dragon that disappeared beneath his jawline. His presence was a physical pressure, a cold front that turned the humid air of the restaurant brittle. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the manager who had suddenly turned the color of ash. His intense, focused gaze was locked entirely on the woman, still kneeling amidst the wreckage of the crystal. Ethan, sensing the shift in the room's gravity, turned in his chair, his smirk still partially plastered on his face. "Hey, do you know who?" The words died in his throat. Ethan's gaze traveled from the handmade Italian loafers to the perfectly tailored lines of the black suit, finally landing on Jae-hyun's face. It was a face of terrifying composure, a mask of stone that promised a violence so calculated it was almost professional. The black dragon didn't need to shout. His authority was a silent scream. Jae-hyun continued his measured stride, the fine silk of his jacket catching the light as he moved. Every eye in the room followed him, but no one dared to breathe. As he reached the center of the floor, he didn't acknowledge Ethan's existence. He simply stopped a few paces away, his squared shoulders casting a long, predatory shadow over the shattered glass and the man who had caused it. The dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse in the dim light. To the elite diners, he was a myth made flesh, the man who controlled the city's heartbeat from the shadows. To Zariah, he was the storm that had finally arrived. To Ethan, he was the beginning of an end he couldn't yet comprehend. Jae-hyun reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, not for a weapon, but for the absolute silence he now commanded. The restaurant, once a theater for Ethan's cruelty, had become a court. And the judge had just taken his place. Han Jae-hyun's shadow fell over Ethan Vaughn like a shroud, darkening the bright white linen of the tablecloth and the expensive steak that now looked like ash. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted from a lively, cruel theater to a vacuum where sound and light seemed to disappear. Ethan's new socialite friends, who had been chirping with laughter moments ago, were now pulling their chairs back, their faces pale as they recognized the dragon etched into the skin of the man who had just appeared. Ethan tried to regain his composure, his fingers trembling as he reached for his wine glass. He didn't know the face, but he knew the aura, the kind of stillness that only belongs to men who have seen the worst of the world and conquered it. He felt a sudden, icy prickle at the base of his neck. "You're at the wrong table, buddy," Ethan stammered, his voice cracking, betraying the terror he tried to hide behind his tailored facade. "We're in the middle of something here." Jae-hyun didn't blink. He didn't even look at Ethan. His eyes were fixed on the floor, on the jagged crystal shards, and the way Zariah's fingers were curled defensively near the debris. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was not a shout. It was a low, vibrating hum, a sound of controlled, absolute power that made the glassware on the table rattle. "Remove your foot," Jae-hyun said. The command was so quiet it was terrifying. Ethan blinked, confused, his leg still twitching from the motion of the kick he'd delivered seconds ago. "What did you say?" Jae-hyun took a single step closer, closing the distance until the heat from his body was palpable. He leaned down slightly, his gaze finally snapping to Ethan's eyes with the force of a physical blow. The dragon on his neck seemed to shift with the movement of his jaw. "I will not repeat myself. Remove your foot from the proximity of my fiancé, or I will ensure you never use that leg to walk again." The fiancé comment hit the room like a physical explosion. A collective gasp escaped the surrounding tables. Ethan's mouth hung open, his gaze darting between the lowly waitress on the floor and the titan standing over him. The diamond hidden beneath Zariah's service glove, the one she had kept turned inward to avoid drawing attention, seemed to catch a stray beam of light from the chandelier, flashing with a brilliance that blinded Ethan's pride. "Your fiancé," Ethan whispered, his face draining of all color. Zariah slowly stood up. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She brushed a stray curl from her face, her athletic frame straightening with a dignity that eclipsed every old money guest in the room. She didn't look at Ethan with anger. She looked at him with the cold, detached pity one reserved for a bug about to be stepped on. Jae-hyun reached out, his hand large, scarred, and steady, finding the small of her back. It was a gesture of total possession and lethal protection. Ethan realized then, with a sinking horror in his gut, that he hadn't just insulted a waitress. He had declared war on the only man in the city who could erase him without leaving a trace. Ethan gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as he looked up at the man everyone in the city whispered about in terrified tones. The Black Dragon was no longer just a shadow in the news. He was a physical force of nature standing inches away. Ethan tried to find his voice, a desperate attempt to salvage the remains of his shattered ego. "Fiancé," Ethan let out a forced, breathless laugh that died as soon as it hit the cold air. "You've been played, Mr. Han. This woman is a nobody. She's a servant. She's been scrubbing floors and taking orders for months. I don't know what kind of sob story she told you, but you're standing in the most exclusive restaurant in the district. This isn't a place for someone like her." Han Jae-hyun didn't move. He didn't even look at Ethan. Instead, he reached out and took Zariah's hand, the one Ethan had just pinned to the floor, and gently brushed the dust from her knuckles. His touch was incredibly tender, a jarring contrast to the lethal energy radiating from his frame. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Vaughn," Jae-hyun said, his voice dropping into a register so low it seemed to vibrate the floorboards. "This is an exclusive establishment, which is why I found it unacceptable that the previous management allowed a customer to harass my wife." Ethan blinked, his brow furrowing. "Previous management?" Jae-hyun finally turned his head, his eyes locking onto Ethan's with a predatory focus. "I didn't come here tonight just to dine, Ethan. I came to inspect my latest acquisition. You see, Zariah mentioned she liked the architecture of this building and the potential of the staff. So at 9:00 a.m. this morning, the deed for this entire property, the restaurant, the land, and every contract within it was transferred to the Black Dragon Syndicate." A deafening silence fell over the table. The restaurant manager, who had been standing by with a look of smug indifference, suddenly looked as though he were about to faint. "You're lying," Ethan whispered, though his eyes betrayed his terror as they darted to the manager. "Check your email, Mr. Kim," Jae-hyun said, addressing the manager without looking at him. The man fumbled for his tablet, his fingers shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. A second later, the manager's face drained of every drop of color. It's true," the manager stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. "The ownership, it's been updated. Everything belongs to Mr. Han." Jae-hyun turned back to Ethan, a ghost of a smile appearing on his face, a look that held no warmth, only the promise of a coming storm. "Which means, Ethan, that you are currently trespassing on my property. And more importantly, you have just assaulted the woman who now holds your lease, your family's corporate catering contracts, and your very future in her hands." Zariah stepped forward, her athletic frame casting a shadow over Ethan's expensive dinner. She didn't need to shout. The simple act of standing next to Jae-hyun made her look like the queen she had always been. "I told you that you didn't know who I was, Ethan," she said softly, her voice steady and clear. "But don't worry. By the time my husband is finished with you, you'll know exactly who I am. You'll hear my name every time you realize you have nothing left." Jae-hyun's hand tightened slightly on Zariah. "The menu has changed tonight, Ethan, and I'm afraid you're no longer a guest. You're the main course." Jae-hyun didn't waste time with further threats. He signaled once with a slight inclination of his head. A man who had been standing silently in the periphery, a blur in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, stepped forward, holding a slim, high-definition tablet. He didn't speak. He simply tilted the screen toward Ethan, forcing the younger man to face the carnage. Ethan looked down, his eyes widening. On the vibrant display, a live financial dashboard pulsed in a sea of aggressive, terrifying red. The ticker for Vaughn Enterprises, his father's legacy, was in a freefall. The line graph didn't just slope downward, it plunged with the violent, erratic motion of a crashing plane. In the time it took you to kick Zariah, my team has triggered a hostile sell-off of your primary liquid assets, Jae-hyun said, his voice as calm as a summer breeze, which only served to make the terror more acute. Your father's firm relied on an unsecured credit line from a firm that is currently in the process of being acquired by the Black Dragon Syndicate. As of 60 seconds ago, that line has been called in full. Ethan's breath hitched, a strangled sound that died in his throat. He reached for his phone, his thumbs swiping frantically, but his screens were already flickering. Notifications were flooding in, emails from his father, alerts from his bank, legal notices from the SEC. His phone, once a symbol of his connectivity and status, was becoming a glowing brick of bad news. Every bridge your father built over the last 20 years has just been burned, the assistant added, his voice devoid of emotion. The investors have panicked. The board of directors is convening an emergency session to strip you and your father of executive control. By the time the sun rises, the name Vaughn will be synonymous with bankruptcy. Ethan looked up, his face ashen, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the tablecloth to stay upright. He had come here to play the part of a king, to bask in the admiration of his peers, but the floor beneath him felt like it was dissolving. The room was no longer filled with people who envied him. It was filled with witnesses to his total, catastrophic undoing. Zariah stood beside Jae-hyun, a silent sentry in her service apron. She didn't gloat, she didn't laugh, and she didn't offer a shred of pity. She simply watched with the cool, calculating intelligence of a woman who understood exactly how the world worked. She had built her empire from the ground up, brick by brick, and watching Ethan's glass castle shatter was not a victory, it was a simple correction of the balance. "You wanted to show everyone how powerful you were," Jae-hyun whispered, leaning in so close that Ethan could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and expensive cologne. "But you forgot the first rule of this city, Ethan. You never punch down at someone who owns the ground you're standing on." Ethan's knees finally buckled, and he collapsed back into his chair, a broken man in an expensive suit, listening to the chime of notifications signaling the death of his future. The chaos of the digital collapse hummed in the background, a frantic symphony of vibrating phones and panicked whispers, but Zariah remained the calm center of the storm. She looked down at her hand, the one Ethan had so carelessly tried to crush beneath his heel. With a deliberate, slow motion, she reached for the hem of her black service glove. The room seemed to tilt as the crowd realized she wasn't just checking for bruises. Ethan's fiancé, Jae-hyun, watched with wide, trembling eyes, her hand instinctively covering her own engagement ring, a 2-carat marquise cut she had flaunted earlier like a trophy. It was a beautiful stone, expensive by any normal standard, but as Zariah peeled back the dark fabric, the light in the restaurant didn't just reflect, it exploded. From a hidden inner pocket beneath the silk lining of her glove, Zariah drew out a ring that defied the very laws of the room's dim lighting. It was a flawless, D-color, 10-carat Ashoka-cut diamond, set in a band of rare, blackened platinum that mirrored the dragon ink on Jae-hyun's neck. The stone was so large and so perfect that it looked like a shard of the sun had been captured and tamed to sit upon her finger. As Zariah slid the ring onto her finger, the silence in the restaurant became absolute. Jae-hyun's breath hitched in her throat. Beside her own ring, Zariah looked like a relic of an ancient empire compared to a child's toy. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a statement of rank. It was the physical manifestation of the Black Dragon's total devotion. "You said I was built to follow instructions, Ethan," Zariah said, her voice sounding like velvet over gravel. She raised her hand, the diamond throwing fractured rainbows across the pale, sweat-streaked skin of Ethan's face. "The only instruction I've been following lately is the one my fiancé gave me when he placed this in my hand." He told me that from the moment I said yes, the world would never be allowed to look down on me again. Ethan stared at the ring, his eyes bulging. He had spent his entire life measuring worth by the weight of gold and the clarity of stones, and he knew instantly that the single piece of jewelry on Zariah's hand was worth more than his entire family's remaining liquidated assets. His mind reeled, trying to reconcile the servant he had mocked with the woman now wearing a king's ransom on her hand. Jae-hyun leaned in, his lips brushing Zariah's temple in a rare, public display of affection that sent a chill through every witness. "It looks better on you than it did in the vault," he murmured, his voice loud enough for the entire table to hear. He then turned his cold, predatory gaze back to Ethan. "My wife doesn't serve, Ethan. She reigns. And you've spent your last few minutes in her presence standing up. I think it's time you learned some humility." The socialites at the table looked from Zariah's glowing hand to the red-streaked tablets in front of them. The hierarchy had been permanently rewritten. The waitress was gone. In her place stood the future matriarch of the syndicate, and her first act of power was the total, silent eclipsing of the man who thought he could break her. The flash of Zariah's ring seemed to act as a signal for the rats to flee the sinking ship. Ethan's associates, who had spent the evening laughing at his jokes and recording Zariah's fall with cruel delight, suddenly looked as though they were trapped in a cage with a starving predator. They didn't look at Ethan with sympathy. They looked at him with the cold, calculating eyes of people who knew that proximity to him was now a death sentence. Jae-hyun was the first to move. She stood up so abruptly her chair screeched against the marble floor, a sound that grated through the tense silence. She didn't look at the man she had promised to marry. She looked only at Zariah, her face twisted into a mask of terrified servility. With trembling fingers, she slid the Marquis's diamond ring, the one she had been flaunting like a weapon, off her finger and placed it on the table with a muffled clink. "I had no idea, Zariah," Jae-hyun whispered, her voice thin and desperate. "Ethan told me you were just. He lied to me. He lied to all of us. I would never have been part of this if I knew the truth." "Jae-hyun, what are you doing?" Ethan stammered, reaching out for her arm. She flinched away as if his touch were radioactive. "Don't touch me, Ethan. Your family is a fraud and your character is worse. I'm not going down with you." She turned to Han Jae-hyun, bowing so low her forehead nearly touched the edge of the mahogany table. "Please, Mr. Han, I have nothing to do with his actions. My family is a loyal supporter of your logistics group. Please don't let his madness ruin us." The two men in the slate-gray suits followed suit immediately. They didn't even say goodbye. They simply gathered their phones, avoided Jae-hyun's lethal gaze, and backed away from the table in a hurried, awkward retreat. They left their half-eaten steaks and expensive wine behind, eager to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the man whose name was currently being erased from the city's records. Ethan sat alone at the center of the vast table, surrounded by empty chairs and the echoing silence of his own ruin. He looked like a child wearing a man's suit, his shoulders slumped and his face a ghostly, translucent white. He looked at the ring Jae-hyun had left behind, then up at Zariah, who stood tall and unshakable beside the black dragon. The friends who had validated his cruelty had vanished like smoke in a gale. "You see, Ethan," Zariah said, her voice filled with a quiet, devastating clarity. "They didn't love you. They loved the shadow you cast, and now that the sun has gone down on the Vaughn name, there's nothing left but the dark." Jae-hyun didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply stood there, a mountain of dark authority, watching as Ethan realized that in his world of old money and high status, loyalty was just another commodity that had just been sold short. The betrayal was complete. Ethan Vaughn was no longer a player. He was an island, and the tide was coming in fast. The restaurant had become a tomb of Ethan's own making. He sat amidst the wreckage of his former life, his eyes darting from the empty chairs of his friends to the terrifying, unmoving "You thought this apron was a sign of my failure, but it was my choice. This restaurant was my pride, and you've just made it dirty." Ethan looked up, his lips trembling, a pathetic plea forming in his throat. "Zariah, please, we can talk about this. I was under a lot of pressure. I didn't mean." "You meant every second of it," she interrupted, her eyes turning into cold flint. "You enjoyed the sound of my fall. You enjoyed the feeling of your shoe on my hand. But you forgot one very important thing. The floor you're standing on belongs to me now, and I don't allow trash in my dining room." Zariah turned her gaze toward the restaurant's security team, men who had stood by and watched Ethan trip her, men who had prioritized a wealthy bully over a hardworking woman. They stood at stiff attention now, their faces ashen, waiting for the word that would decide their own fates. "The night is over," Zariah commanded, her voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a blade. "Remove the trash from my property, and I want it done publicly." Before Ethan could protest, two of the syndicate's personal guards stepped forward. They didn't use the polite, gloved hands of restaurant security. They seized Ethan by the arms of his $10,000 suit, hoisting him from his chair so abruptly his head snapped back. He began to thrash, a high, thin wail of desperation escaping his lips as he was dragged across the marble floor he had so recently used to humiliate her. The guests watched in stunned silence as the former Prince of Industry was hauled toward the grand entrance. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, revealing a sudden, torrential Gangnam downpour. With a single, coordinated heave, the guards threw Ethan Vaughn out into the street. He landed hard on the wet pavement, his expensive suit soaking up the gutter water, his face illuminated by the harsh neon lights of the city that had just erased his name. Jae-hyun stepped to Zariah's side, his hand finding the small of her back. "Is that enough?" he murmured. Zariah watched through the glass as the doors closed, sealing Ethan out in the cold and the dark. "No," she whispered, a small, cold smile touching her lips. "That was just the appetizer. Now it's time to handle the people who watched it happen." The final order had been given. The restaurant was hers, the city was his, and the man who thought he could kick a waitress had just learned that some women are born to wear crowns, even when they're wearing an apron. The heavy rain drummed against the panoramic windows, a rhythmic backdrop to the chilling silence that had reclaimed the restaurant. Zariah stood at the edge of the dining floor, her white service shirt still marked by the dust of the fall, but her presence had expanded to fill every inch of the vaulted room. She didn't look at the door where Ethan had been discarded. He was already a ghost to her, a footnote in the history of an empire he had been too blind to recognize. Jae-hyun extended his arm, his hand resting firmly yet reverently on the small of her back as he guided her toward the center of the room. Every staff member stood frozen, their heads bowed in a desperate, belated show of respect. As they reached the long, mahogany table where the feast of the elite still sat cooling, Zariah didn't stop. She bypassed the chairs where the socialites had sat and walked directly to the head of the table, the seat of absolute authority. With a slow, deliberate grace, she pulled the chair out. The silk of her trousers whispered against the upholstery as she took her seat. She rested her hands on the table, the 10-carat diamond catching the light of the chandeliers and casting sharp, prismatic fractals across the faces of the trembling manager and the remaining staff. "Mr. Kim," Zariah said, her voice low and terrifyingly calm. The manager flinched at the sound of his name. "You watched a man assault a woman in your establishment and did nothing because his shoes cost more than your monthly salary. You prioritized a status that was built on debt and lies over the dignity of your own team." "Ma'am, I was only trying to maintain the peace," Kim stammered, his eyes darting to Jae-hyun, who stood behind Zariah like a silent, dark-clad god of retribution. "You maintained nothing," Zariah countered, her gaze pinning him to the spot. "You allowed my restaurant to become a theater for a bully. You are relieved of your duties, effective immediately. Every security guard who stood by and filmed will find their final checks waiting at the back door. You are blacklisted from the Zeline Group and the Black Dragon Syndicate's properties. In this city, that means you are finished." She turned her head slightly, her curls catching the light as she looked toward the service corridor. "Mr. Park, please step forward." The older janitor, the only one who had tried to intervene, shuffled out from the shadows, his face etched with confusion and humility. Zariah's expression softened, the cold flint in her eyes warming for the first time that night. "You were the only man in this room today, Mr. Park," she said softly. "As of tonight, you are the head of operations for this building. You'll have a budget to hire people who actually understand what it means to protect, and you'll receive a stake in the restaurant's quarterly profits. Yi Hyun leaned down, his lips ghosting near her ear as he placed a hand on her shoulder, the dragon tattoo on his neck a silent seal of his approval. The kitchen is waiting for your orders, my queen. Zariah looked out over the empty, gold-leafed room. She was no longer the undercover observer, she was the matriarch. She had shed the apron of the underestimated to reveal the armor of the powerful. "Clear the table," she commanded, her voice ringing with the finality of a new era. "The trash has been removed. Now let's begin the real work."